Shalom, welcome back, and we are continuing with our study of the book of Galatians. We're up to part 6. Hopefully this will be the last part of this series, and it's really turned into more of a series on Paul in general. You know, I kind of stayed away from making things solely about Paul. I know I've mentioned him several times in my other teachings and the controversy surrounding him, but I've never really gotten completely into explaining some of the things I say in my other videos and such and so forth. And so that's part of the reason I'm doing this, is so that when you hear me mention things about Paul and my suspicions of him, that you can see where my suspicions are grounded in. They're not, as some have accused me and others, of just not liking Paul or whatever, or oh, you just don't study enough, so you don't understand Paul from a Hebraic perspective. You know, there's all these things that people are kind of programmed to say. You know, Paul was Torah observant. You don't understand him from a Hebraic perspective, and all this other stuff. But in reality, the people he was opposed to were Hebrews. I mean, are we to believe that James and John and Kepha did not understand Paul from a Hebraic perspective? And keep in mind also, you know, this accusation about mistranslations have caused the church to misunderstand Paul. Well, the thing is that the early church, up until about the 5th or 6th century, I mean, they spoke Greek. They were not reading translations of Paul. They were reading Paul in the original Greek. At the Council of Nicaea, they were all speaking Greek. It was not a translation issue. I don't think Paul's been misunderstood. I think the Hebraic Roots movement misunderstands Paul on purpose because they're trying to protect their theology of the Bible being infallible. But they don't ever stop to ask themselves, is that what Yeshua and his earliest apostles believed? And if you actually go and look and study into that, you'll see that they did not regard the scriptures as being infallible. They regarded the scriptures as being corrupted by the lying pen of the scribes. And so the final lying pen of the scribe, so to speak, would have been the writings of Paul and Luke, possibly. So in part 1, we saw that Paul wrote Galatians as a response to an incident when he had a disagreement with Kepha. We're not told exactly what the incident was. We just know that whatever it was, it caused this division between Paul and the other believers. And that included members of Yeshua's own family. In parts 2 through 4, we went and looked more into Paul's letters. We looked at the path that he was traveling in his second and third missionary journey, which happened in between the book of Galatians and Paul's final trip to Jerusalem that we're told about. And so we also saw that the people that Paul was highly critical of in his letters were all members of Yeshua's family and his inner circle of believers. They were not this rogue group that was known as the circumcision that were taught in Sunday school. It was the circumcision themselves were the original followers of Yeshua. You know, James, when Eusebius in his church history speaks about the Jerusalem assembly, he refers to James as the first bishop of the circumcision. The circumcision was the Jerusalem assembly. It was not a faction within it. And so in these letters, Paul's preparing to return to Jerusalem, and he's asking for prayers. You know, he numerous times he's making comments that indicate that he's nervous about this trip because he knows that the very people that he is going to see are the people that he's been in opposition to. And in the book of 2 Corinthians, his assemblies are demanding that he brings letters from James approving of Paul's teaching. That for whatever reason, the word has got out that Paul's teaching something different than James, and that the people are being told that they cannot accept a teacher unless they have letters of recommendation from James. And we see that in the Nazarene Acts. And so Paul is now going to Jerusalem, and my theory is that he's going with the hopes of getting this letter from James. And we'll see that we saw that when Paul got to Jerusalem, the first thing he did the very next day was he went in to see James. So in part 5, we looked at how Paul avoids stopping at Ephesus. In Acts, it says it was because Paul was in a hurry, but of course he stops at the next town and then sends word for the elders of Ephesus to come to him. So it doesn't appear that he's avoiding Ephesus because he's in a hurry. It appears that he's avoiding Ephesus because he's trying to avoid Ephesus. Otherwise, it would have been quicker for him just to stop there and meet with the elders instead of going to another town, sending messengers to them, and then having them come to him. So, Paul gets to Jerusalem. He goes in to meet with the Jerusalem assembly as soon as he gets there. And they send him into the temple to face these myriads of zealots that they told him about, who were zealous for the Torah and have heard that he's teaching apostasy all through Asia. And of course, when he gets there, the Jews from Asia see him and attack him, and he eventually, Roman soldiers come and rescue him. And so that's where we're picking up in Acts 23. So Paul is now, he's been taken to Caesarea. He has been delivered to the governor there. And the governor has determined that Paul is to be kept in the palace of Herod, which, you can't make this up. It's just too funny, because one of the things we looked at last time was that Paul is a family member of the Herods. And, it explains a lot of the things we see in Acts, where his sister's brother, Paul's nephew, is able to come into Fort Antonia, into the barracks, to visit with Paul. And then Paul tells the commander, hey, he's got a message for you. And the commander, takes the boy aside and hearkens to his, to the information that he gives him about these men that are seeking to kill Paul. And in the middle of the night, this commander of the guard gets hundreds of soldiers to escort Paul up to Caesarea. Why would, really, if it was just some Jewish rabbi who had fallen into ill repute with the zealots, why does the commander of the army seem to deem him worthy of having hundreds of people, hundreds of soldiers leave Jerusalem to take him up to Caesarea? And it makes no difference, it makes no sense unless Paul's a member of the Herodian family, which is what I believe to be the case. So we pick it up in Acts 24. It says, after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with the elders and a certain speaker, Tertullus, and they brought charges against Shaul before the governor. And when he was called upon, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, for having found this man a plague who stirs up dissension among all the Yahudim throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, who also tried to profane the set apart place, and who we seized and wished to judge him according to our law. But the commander Lysias came along and with much violence took him out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come to you. And by examining him yourself, you shall be able to know all these matters of which we accuse him. And the Jews also agreed, maintaining these matters were so. And so, here you see a basic, breakdown of what happened. Paul is accused of being this ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, but he certainly wasn't. We know who the ringleader was. The ringleader would have been James. But yet James is, if you think about it, I think that it reveals a lot about the situation if you look at who were the enemies of James and Paul and who were the friends of James and Paul. James was a friend of the common people. The common people looked up to James and adored him, but yet he was a thorn in the side of the religious establishment, as was Yeshua. The same people hated James that hated Yeshua, and the same people protected James that protected Yeshua. But if you look at Paul, Paul's being protected by the Romans. He's being protected by the Herodians. He's being protected by the establishment. And it's humorous, if you think about it, that now you have a Herod being tried by the Herodian high priest. Because that's who Ananias was. I mean, Ananias was appointed by the Herods. And later in this presentation, I'll show you the proof that he was appointed by the Herods. So it's humorous that here you have the cousin of Agrippa standing before the high priest Ananias, and yet Ananias was appointed by Agrippa. It makes no sense. You got, basically Paul standing before his own high priest. And in the beginning of the book of Acts, of course, we saw that Paul was an agent of the high priest. And by the end of this presentation, you'll see that Paul never ceased to be an agent of the high priest, regardless of what this chapter in Acts says, where it pictures the high priest and Paul opposed to one another. They were certainly comrades. So again, here it's mentioned in verse 7 that, of course, the Romans came by and rescued Paul. And then a couple of verses later, it says the governor motioned to Paul to speak. And so Paul says, knowing that for many years I've been a judge of this nation, I gladly defend myself. And so he's, going on and on about how great of a Jew he is. And he says, and this I confess to you that according to the way, which they call a sect, so I also worship the Elohim of my fathers, believing all that has been written in the Torah and the prophets. And, of course, we know from Paul's letters, we know from the book of Acts, that this is really not true. I mean, it's a lot more obvious in Paul's letters, and I think the author of Acts tries to play down the fact that Paul had a different theology than the other Nazarenes. In fact, I think that's what's going on here. The reason Paul is being called the ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes is because the book of Acts was written after the death of James. In fact, it was probably written after Josephus wrote the book of the Antiquities, because the author of the book of Acts seems to draw a lot of his information from Josephus. So that indicates that either Josephus wrote the book of Acts, which that has been theorized, or that the book of Acts was written after Josephus wrote his works. So this book, the book of Acts, would have been written after the fact. And I think it was written after the fact for the sole purpose of turning Paul into a full-fledged member of the Nazarenes and not the outsider that he was during his lifetime. And he says, in this I exercise myself to have a clear conscience toward Elohim and men always, and after many years I came to bring kind deeds to the nation and offerings, at which times certain Jews from Asia found me cleansed in the set-apart place, neither with a crowd nor with a disturbance, who ought to be present before you to bring charges if they have a matter against me. So notice he's saying that the zealots are not there. The people accusing Paul are not there. It's now the Sanhedrin. And again, it's Agrippa's Sanhedrin. It's the same people that hired Paul to go out and persecute the Nazarenes to begin with. And so again, he follows it all up by throwing out this line that supposedly got him out of trouble before, which is that he was being judged because of his belief in the resurrection of the dead. And so we saw that last time when the Sanhedrin was trying him, that he just mentioned the resurrection, and the members of the Sanhedrin lost all control of their senses and started fighting with one another. Okay, so then it says in verse 22, and having heard this, having known more exactly about the way, Felix put them off, saying, when Lysias the commander comes down, I shall decide your case. And he ordered the captain to keep Paul and to have ease, and not to forbid any of his friends to attend to him. So Felix makes his decision that, well, Paul needs to stay in the palace, and we're not going to hinder any of his friends from coming to visit him. Now, we could break here for a minute and just say, do you see any mention of any of the apostles coming to see Paul? There's no mention of it. What does that say about the Jerusalem assembly? If Paul was truly their brother, why do none of them come to see him? Why is it not worthy of mentioning if one of the 12 apostles comes up here to visit Paul? Do you not think it would be mentioned? I think it's an interesting question to ask, because according to this, Paul's friends are not forbidden from coming to see him, which again, it more reinforces the fact that Paul's being held in protective custody. He's not in prison as the book of Acts tries to make it look like. It says, after some days, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was a female Jew. He sent for Paul and heard him concerning the belief of Messiah, and he reasoned about righteousness and self-control and judgment to come. And Felix became frightened and said, for the present go, and when I find time I shall send for you. And at the same time, too, he was anticipating that silver would be given him by Shaul, that he might release him. Therefore he sent for him more often and conversed with him. Okay, so again, with response to the whole belief that Paul was a member of the Herodian royal family, notice that it says that Felix is coming to hang out with him because he's wanting to get silver. So who are these people coming and hanging out with Paul? Who is Felix and Drusilla? The majority of people listening to this, majority of people that have read about Felix and Drusilla in the Bible, have never taken the time to research actually who they are. And so for that purpose, I'm going to turn now to Josephus, the Antiquities, when he speaks about Drusilla and Felix. So it says, and thus did King Agrippa, this would have been Agrippa the First, depart this life, and that would have been in 44 AD. But he left behind him a son, Agrippa II, by name, a youth, which in the 17th year of his age, and 3 daughters, one of which, Bernice, was married to Herod, his father's brother, and was 16 years old. The other 2, Mariamne and Drusilla, were still virgins. The former was 10 years old, and Drusilla was 6. Now these, his daughters, were thus espoused by their father, Mariamne to Julius Archelaus Epiphanes, the son of Antiochus, the son of Chalcias, and Drusilla to the king of Commagene. But when it was known that Agrippa was departed this life, the inhabitants of Caesarea and of Sebaste forgot the kindness he had bestowed on them and acted on the part of the bitterest enemies. And then Josephus goes into some details about how the people were taking down statues of the daughters of Agrippa the First and setting them up in the whorehouses and all this other kind of stuff that they were doing to, voice their disdain toward Agrippa the First. So at the time that Agrippa died, Drusilla was 6 years old. Now at the time that she's coming before Paul, she'll be around 18 or 19 years old, and she's married to Felix. So it goes on to say, and Claudius sent Felix, the brother of Paulus, to take care of the affairs of Judea. And when he had already completed the 12th year of his reign, he bestowed upon Agrippa the tetrarchy of Philip and Bithynia, and added thereto Trachonius with Albila, I guess is how you say it, which last had been the tetrarchy of Licinius. But he took from him Chalcis when he had been governor thereof 4 years, and when Agrippa, that's Agrippa II, had received these countries as a gift of Caesar, he gave his sister Drusilla in marriage to Azizus, king of Emesa, upon his consent to be circumcised, for Epiphanius, the son of King Antiochus, had refused to marry her because after he had been promised her father formerly to come over to the Jewish religion, he would not now perform that promise. So essentially, what we know about Agrippa I is that he actually was a Jew. Like I mentioned earlier in the last video, that kind of the trait of the Herods is that they will give lip service to being, a Jew. They will give money to the temple and so forth. And so to the Jews, they're a Jew, but at the same time, they also donate money to build pagan temples and build up pagan cities and all this other stuff. So to the pagans, they're pagan. To the Jews, they're a Jew. In much the same way that Paul, when he wrote about in his letters, that to the Jew, I became as a Jew. To the weak, or to the apostles, I became as an apostle. So basically, they just play the part of whoever, they're the, consummate politician. They just play to whatever party's in front of them. And so, but it appears that Agrippa the First was actually attempting to be a devout Jew. Now, the Herods, of course, were not ethnically Jewish. They were Greek or Idumean. But Herod the Great married Mariamne, who was a daughter of one of the high priests, one of the Hashmonean high priests. So in that respect, they were half Jewish. But Agrippa the First was trying to be a Jew, he was trying to be devout, I think, based upon the information we have. Now, his son, Agrippa the Second, and the rest of their family did not follow in their father's footsteps. So Agrippa the First had promised Drusilla to this, the son of King Antiochus, under the condition that he would become circumcised and become a Jew. But after the death of Agrippa the First, this Epiphanes, he refused to become circumcised. So Agrippa the Second gave his sister in marriage to Azazus, the king of Emesa, instead. And of course, he got circumcised for the purpose of being able to marry Drusilla. As I said, but the marriage of Drusilla with Azazus was in no long time afterward dissolved upon the following occasion. While Felix was procurator of Judea, he saw Drusilla, fell in love with her, for she did indeed exceed all other women in beauty, and he sent to her a person whose name was Simon, one of his friends, a Jew he was, and by birth a Cypriot, and one who pretended to be a magician. Okay, so now you got Simon the magician getting involved here. So he's going to Drusilla, and he's endeavoring to persuade her to forsake her present husband and marry Felix. And he promised that if she would not refuse him, he would make her a happy woman, and accordingly she was prevailed upon to transgress the laws of her forefathers and to marry Felix. And when he had a son by her, he named him Agrippa. And after what manner the young man with his wife perished in the conflagration of the mountain Vesuvius in the days of Titus Caesar. Okay, so basically, Felix uses Simon the magician to convince Drusilla to leave her first husband and marry him instead. And that then Drusilla ends up getting killed in the eruption of Vesuvius in, I think, 79 AD. So that's... Now, before we move on, I will point out that if you've ever read the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're very, very critical. They condemn this group of leaders within Jerusalem who are constantly marrying each other's nieces and trading wives around. And so it's almost like you think of Hollywood, the way people in Hollywood will get married, and then the next year they divorce and marry someone else, and they just kind of pass their wives around. That's something that the Dead Sea Scrolls were very strongly against. And scholars are trying to place the Dead Sea Scrolls back in the 1st century BC, and they're saying that these groups that the Dead Sea Scrolls are critical of is the Hashmoneans. But now we have no evidence that the Hashmoneans were doing any of that. There was none of this niece marriage type stuff going on with the Hashmoneans, but it was going on with the Herods extensively. Like if you do any research into the Herodians and their family tree, or you just read Josephus, you'll see that it is something that is constantly spoken of by Josephus that the Herods were doing, which again places the Dead Sea Scrolls during the 1st century AD, which is what the scholarly groups are trying to avoid, because they're trying to avoid this association with Yeshua. So that's what's going on here with Drusilla and Felix. So these are the exact opposite kind of people that you would expect James and the Jerusalem assembly would be rubbing elbows with. But yet Paul is hanging out with these people. And it says this goes on for 2 years, where Felix and Paul have this kind of relationship where they'll visit together often. So we go back to Acts. Right here's where he picked up. Felix comes with his wife Drusilla. They're expecting Paul to give them some money. And so it says, therefore he sent for him more often and conversed with him. But after 2 years had passed, Festus succeeds Felix. And so we know when this occurred. It's fortunate that this is put in the book of Acts, because this gives us a date that we can definitely recognize, that because we know from the historical records that Festus replaced Felix in 60 AD, which then puts Paul's trip to Jerusalem in 58 AD. And so, it gives us a timeline here. So here we are in 60 AD, and it says, in wishing to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul bound. So I don't know. I think it's hilarious. So Paul's being left in the palace after 2 years. So he's been in protective custody in the palace of Agrippa for 2 years. And it says, Festus, therefore, having come to the province, 3 days later went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, and the high priest and the chief men of the Yahudim informed him against Paul, and they begged him, asking favor against him, that he would send him to Jerusalem, making a plot along the way to kill him. Then indeed Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and he himself was about to set out shortly. So he's getting ready to go up to Caesarea. But notice that you still see this protection of Paul by the Romans. Therefore he said, let those who have authority among you go down with me and accuse this man to see if there is any fault in him. And having spent more than 10 days among them, he went down to Caesarea. And on the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought. And when he had come, the Jews who had gone down from Jerusalem stood about, bringing many heavy charges against Paul, which they were unable to prove. While Paul said in his own defense, neither against the Torah of the Jews have I, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any sin. So, of course, we know that in Paul's letters, he's constantly talking against the Jews and against the Torah. Now, I don't doubt that he wasn't speaking against the temple, because the temple was controlled by the Herods. So why would Paul be teaching against the temple? And I don't think we see that in any of his letters. And going on, it says, but Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, do you wish to go to Jerusalem and be judged before me there concerning these matters? And Paul said, I am standing at Caesar's judgment seat, where I should be judged. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you know well enough. For if indeed I do wrong, or have committed whatsoever deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if there is none at all in these matters of which these men accuse me, no one is able to give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar then. Okay, so then Festus, having talked with the council, answered, if you appeal to Caesar you shall go. So Paul is saying that he wants Caesar to judge him. I think there's a certain level of irony here. People think that Paul is like this good, devout Jew. But would a devout Jew be asking for Caesar to judge him instead of the Sanhedrin? I think it's a question worth being answered, or at least worth being asked. Okay, so then certain days having passed, now you see Agrippa II and Bernice coming to Caesarea to greet Festus. And when they had spent many days there, Festus laid Shaul's case before the sovereign, saying, there is a man here whom Felix left as prisoner. Okay, now this is funny. So now you have Herod Agrippa II, coming with his sister Bernice to Caesarea, to his palace that Paul's been living in for the last 2 years, and now they're acting like Agrippa does not know who Paul is. It says, Agrippa says to Festus, I was wishing also to hear the man myself. And he said, and so Festus says, tomorrow you shall hear him. Therefore, on the next day, Agrippa and Bernice, having come with a great show, and having entered the place of hearing with the commanders and the eminent men of the city, Shaul was brought in at the order of Festus. So now you have Paul standing before Bernice and Agrippa. So now who is Bernice and Agrippa? So Josephus in the Antiquities, he says that, but as for Bernice, she lived a widow a long while after the death of Herod, the king of Chalcis, who was both her husband and her uncle. Okay, so again, you see this niece marriage going on, which the Dead Sea Scrolls talked about. But when the report went out that she had criminal conversation with her brother, Agrippa II, okay, so what is this criminal conversation? This is incest. So there were rumors going around that she had incest with her brother. She persuaded Ptolemy, who was king of Sicilia, to be circumcised and to marry her, as supposing that by this means she should prove these calamities upon her to be false. And Ptolemy was prevailed upon, and that chiefly on account of her riches. Yet did not this matrimony endure long, but Bernice left Ptolemy, and as was said, with impure intentions. So he forsook at once this matrimony and the Jewish religion. At the same time, Mariamne put away Archelaus and was married to Demetrius, the principal man among the Alexandrian Jews, both for his family and his wealth, and indeed he was then their alabarch. So you see Bernice and her sister Mariamne again, swapping around husbands. Bernice marries this Ptolemy because of the rumors that her and her brother are lovers, and then she ends up leaving Ptolemy and moving back in with her brother, Agrippa II. And so these rumors were widespread that Agrippa and his sister were involved with each other. And then this is from Wikipedia. It says, what little is known about Bernice, her life and her background comes mostly from the early historian Flavius Josephus. However, it is for her tumultuous love life that she is primarily known from the Renaissance. After a number of failed marriages through the 40s, she spent much of the remainder of her life at the court of her brother Herod Agrippa II. Amidst rumors, the two were carrying on an incestuous relationship. During the First Jewish-Roman War, she began a love affair with the future emperor Titus Flavius Vespasianus. So it's basically Vespasian. And I'm having trouble pronouncing his name for some reason. However, her unpopularity among the Romans compelled Titus to dismiss her on the accession as emperor in 79. When he died 2 years later, she disappeared from the historical record. Okay, so Robert Eisman, when he's speaking about Bernice, he says that if you look at the Whore of Babylon in the book of Revelation, like if there is one person who could really be the embodiment of this Whore of Babylon, it would be Bernice, especially in the eyes of the early Jewish Christians. Multiple marriages, this incestuous relationship with Agrippa, and I think it's worth pointing out, what was the relation of Agrippa to Josephus? After Josephus wrote the Wars of the Jews, Agrippa was so pleased with that he gave Josephus a lot of his private correspondence and letters and such that he had, and Josephus used this material to write the Antiquities. It's interesting that Josephus would even write this about their incestuous relationship. It's almost like I don't really think that Agrippa was ashamed of it, and it's almost like maybe he wanted, if Josephus put this material in his book, The Antiquities, it was probably because Agrippa gave him permission to do so. I don't think this was anything that Agrippa was necessarily embarrassed about. So now, hopefully this gives you kind of a picture of who it was that was coming before Paul. So back to the book of Acts. Is therefore the next day, Agrippa and Bernice having come, Shaul was brought in at the order of Festus. And so then Agrippa says to Shaul, or says to Paul, you are allowed to speak for yourself. Then Paul stretched out his hand and made his defense. I think myself blessed, Sovereign Agrippa, because today I shall make my defense before you, concerning all of which I am accused by the Jews, you being most of all an expert, knowing all the practices and questions which have to do with the Jews. So please hear me patiently. So after what I just told you about Agrippa, do you understand how would this, imagine if you were James and you were reading this conversation that supposedly went on between Paul and Agrippa. Paul is praising Agrippa for knowing all the traditions of the Jews. And yet he's standing there with his sister that he's having an incestuous affair with, conversing with Paul. And Paul's been living in Agrippa's house for the last 2 years. And while saying this in his defense, Festus said with a loud voice, Shaul, you are mad. Much learning has turned you to madness. So I skipped over what all Paul was saying. He just basically goes into his, big speech about how he's such a devout person and believes in Yeshua and all this other stuff. And Festus is like, Paul, you're crazy. And this line itself, I think a lot is revealed into it because it makes it apparent that Agrippa knew Paul. Just the way he's referring to him. Paul, you're crazy. Much learning has turned you crazy. But Paul says, I'm not crazy, most excellent Festus, but I can speak words of truth and sense. Okay, so I guess I got that wrong. It wasn't Agrippa that said it. It was Festus that said it. But he's saying this in front of Agrippa. And it says, for the king, before whom I also speak boldly, knows these matters, for I'm persuaded that none of these are hidden from him, for this has not been done in a corner. Sovereign Agrippa, do you believe in the prophets? I know that you believe. And again, who is Paul saying this to? Agrippa standing there with his sister that he's been sleeping with for the last several years. And Paul is praising Agrippa that he knows the prophets. He's a devout follower of the word. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that would have just incensed the zealots and the Jerusalem assembly to hear Paul saying this kind of stuff to Agrippa. It says, and Agrippa says to Paul, with a little you might persuade me to become a Christian. And Paul said, much or little, I pray to Elohim that not only for you, but also all who hear me today might become such as I am, except for these chains. So Paul's allegedly sitting there in chains. And having said this, the sovereign stood up, as well as the governor and Bernice, and those sitting with them. And having withdrawn, they spoke to each other, saying, this man is doing none at all, deserving death or chains. And Agrippa said to Festus, this man could have been released if he had not appealed to Caesar. So I think that this whole story is written for the sole purpose of getting Paul outside of the land of Judea. Like this whole build-up is because they're trying to get Paul in a boat getting out of Jerusalem. And we're about to see why they don't want Paul in Jerusalem. At least they don't want it known that Paul was in Jerusalem. We're going to see in a moment that he never went to Rome. Or if he did go to Rome, he certainly came back rather quickly. Okay, so when it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a captain of the Augustan regiment. Okay, so this is the very next line. After Agrippa says that about appealing to Caesar, then they're putting Paul on a boat and he's going to Rome. And so we're going to skip over the whole narrative about the trip to Rome. And it says, and when we came to Rome, the captain delivered the prisoners to the captain of the guard, but Paul was allowed to stay by himself with the soldier guarding him. And it came to be after 3 days that Paul called the leaders of the Yahudim together. And when they had come together, he said to them, men, brothers, I have done none at all against our people, the practices of our fathers. I was delivered as a prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans. And he goes on. And it says, and Paul stayed 2 entire years in his own rented house. and was received as those who came to him, proclaiming the reign of Elohim and teaching about the Master Yeshua, Messiah, with all boldness unhindered. Okay, so at the top in verse 16, notice it says that Paul was allowed to stay by himself with the soldier guarding him. So again, he seems to be not really under arrest. He seems to be more as in protective custody. Down here in verse 30, Paul stayed 2 entire years. So Paul went there in 60. That means if he stayed there 2 entire years, that put him in Rome through 62 Common Era. So why is this important? Now notice that that's like the second to last verse in the book of Acts. This is the end of the book of Acts. Paul's there 2 entire years. The end. Why? Why was that important? And again, 60 plus 2 equals 62 AD. Why was that important? Well, see, the book of Acts, the book of Acts ends at probably what was the single most important event in church history after the death of Yeshua. And that was the death of James. So to get the rest of the story, we've got to turn back to Josephus to the book of Antiquities.